one of the things that we mentioned right at the beginning in this was we showed that data set from Astran and Rodal, where I drew the pink line on the graph to show you that quite clearly that as the exercise intensity increases, so does the size of the deficit, but also to show you that it was taking longer to reach steady state. Now that's not the tau, that is just literally it takes longer to reach steady state. And this really brings us on to an understanding of how we link the VO2 kinetics to information we've garnered previously. How do VO2 kinetics link to VO2 max? How do they link to lactate turn point? Or, if you want to use that data because we're in the kind of the same sphere, how do these relate to the ventilatory threshold? So now we're getting into what are referred to as exercise domains and phased-based responses. So here we've got some nice data from Dave Paul and Andy Jones, and these guys are the world leaders in this field. An extraordinary body of work that they've produced. But what you can see on this schematic is just basically the whole information set that you need to know in terms of VO2 responses, the onset of exercise, and exercise domains. So you can see, again, on the x-axis, the time, and the y-axis, the VO2 response. And again, notice what they've done is they're showing you resting conditions, that's minus 120 to 0, so that's 2 minutes of rest. And then in all the conditions, so the conditions are represented by the squiggly lines, which represent the breath-by-breath data. In all those conditions, a square wave transition has been applied in terms of the exercise intensity. But what they're able to show you quite neatly is that there are in fact 3 exercise domains. 3. Moderate intensity exercise is any exercise which is performed below the gas exchange threshold. Some people might refer to that as the lactate turn point, but we're dealing with VO2 data, so we really have to be working with using the same modes. So it's gas exchange threshold, ventilatory threshold. And notice what happens. Under those conditions, we've got 2 conditions. We've got one where you can see that the VO2 response is, this is the lowest line, VO2 rises and levels out, and then slightly higher, again closer to the gas exchange threshold but not above it, again VO2 rises and levels out. But you can see that for both of these conditions with different exercise intensities, and we know the different exercise intensities because we've got different VO2 responses. Remember, the VO2 is matching the QO2, which is a reflection of the ATP demand at the muscle, which is a reflection of the need of the muscle to do work. But in both of those, can you see that we reach steady state? VO2 levels out. Now though, look what happens when you go above gas exchange threshold. And you can see now there are 4 different responses. There is one response that is referred to as the heavy domain response, and this is between what is called the gas exchange threshold, ventilatory threshold, and what we're going to look at in the final podcast of this module, which is critical power. Now, for the purposes of today, let's just refer to critical power as being around about, it's not, but it gives you an example, around about 90% VO2 max. What critical power actually represents is the highest exercise intensity that can be sustained without eliciting VO2 max. Let's say that again. Critical power is the highest exercise intensity that can be sustained without eliciting VO2 max. So if we are exercising between gas exchange threshold and critical power, notice what happens. The deficit is bigger because the intensity has gone up. But can you also notice that the VO2, it actually takes longer to reach steady state? I would say that if you look at the moderate domain trials, that it's at about 120 seconds that they've both pretty much leveled out. If I go to the heavy exercise domain, what you can see in the heavy exercise domain is quite clearly that we're looking at probably between 240 seconds, maybe 300 seconds before it starts to level out. You see it rises and then levels out in the heavy domain. So there's clearly something else going on. And again, just track back from the VO2 data when you think you roughly pinpointed, let's say 240 seconds. you've roughly pinpointed where steady state is. In your mind, draw an imaginary line back horizontally to the VO2, okay, and then draw a vertical line down to 0, and that area is your deficit. Can you see that that deficit is far bigger? We've had to borrow more anaerobic energy than we did in the moderate domain, because the intensity is far greater, the ATP demand is far greater. But look what happens if you go above critical power. And above critical power, remember what I said, the definition of critical power is the highest exercise intensity that can be sustained without eliciting VO2 max. This is referred to as severe exercise, and notice what happens now. You don't reach steady state. Look at the VO2. It keeps rising and rising and rising until it eventually attains VO2 max. So what we have identified are 3 exercise domains. And these are the only exercise domains you need to think about. Exercise is either moderate, below gas exchange threshold, we get steady state. We get a deficit, of course, we have to borrow the energy at the onset of exercise, but we reach steady state in about 2-3 minutes. Heavy. Exercise above the gas exchange threshold but below the critical power. We again reach steady state, but now we're looking at a lot longer. We may be looking up to, well, anything between 5 to 6 minutes to reach steady state, and a significantly bigger deficit than we had in the moderate domain. And then we've got the exercise which is above the critical power, which is in the severe domain, where the VO2 will rise to VO2 max. So clearly, there are different mechanisms and different factors at play between what's going on in the moderate and the heavy and the severe domains. The same rules apply that we referred to earlier in terms of we're borrowing energy at the onset of exercise, but there's other things going on. Why, for example, do you not reach steady state at the same time course in heavy as you do in moderate? Why does VO2 keep rising in the severe domain once we go above critical power and hit VO2 max? So again, this is some data from Dave Paul and Andy Jones, and it just shows you on the right panel the idealized response, the kind of what you'd see in the textbook response for these. So you've got the the time domain on the x-axis, and you've got the you can see the responses for the moderate, heavy, and severe domains. If you look on the left-hand panel, though, what you can see is the VO2 response versus time. And if you look at the moderate, it's that classic. It rises, we get our square wave effect. You get the cardiodynamic response, then you get the phase 2, then it levels out. But look at the heavy. Look at what happens. Something really interesting is it starts to rise. It follows that kind of exponential response, and then it looks like it's about to level out, and then it kicks again, and then levels out. And we can actually see that on the previous graph. Look very carefully, and can you notice that when you get to about 150 seconds, it looks like it's starting to level out, and then it just rises again, and then levels out. You've got to imagine you've got to put almost like an average line between these. And that is referred to as the Vo2 slow component. And the Vo2 slow component is the difference between what would have been anticipated for that exercise intensity, which in this instance will be the light grey line, and what actually happened, which is the solid line. And the difference between the two, which is that hatched area, is the Vo2 slow component. And we need to understand why that occurs. And in the severe domain, again, the light grey line represents what the anticipated VO2 response would be, whereas the solid line represents what actually happens, and it's an ever expanding slow component until VO2 rises to VO2 max. So this is from Andy Jones and Mark Burnley, and again, Mark Burnley is prolific in this field. Mark does a lot of work to do with what's called prior priming that we mentioned in podcast 4, to do with VO2 max, but he's a prolific publisher in this field. He was one of Andy Jones' PhD students. But here you've got a great example of moderate intensity exercise, of the difference between somebody who is well trained in terms of aerobically developed, maybe training, or maybe they haven't got pathologies, and somebody who's less well trained or has maybe got cardiorespiratory pathologies. Look at the time taken to reach steady state. The ATP demand is the same in both instances. That's what the demand is of the muscle to do work. So the amplitude, the difference between the resting, which is, let's call that 0.75, and the exercise intensity, the actual ATP demand of the muscle to do work, which is, let's call that 2.8 litres per minute. That is the amplitude. So we've got an amplitude difference from 0.7 to 2.8. Okay, so we've got a difference there of about 3.1. Okay, mils. Sorry, 3.1 litres per minute. So now look at the difference. The time taken. Can you see that the dashed line is taking a lot longer to reach steady state? The kinetics are slower than the solid line. And maybe they've got a pathology, maybe it's a cardiovascular limitation or a respiratory limitation or a muscular limitation compared to the solid line. But either way, the deficit is far greater for the dashed line response than it is for the solid line response. So in other words, the dashed line response has had to borrow more anaerobic energy in order to meet the demand of the muscle before we reach the steady state condition compared to the solid line condition. Now here's heavy. So you can see we're below VO2 max. So in the heavy domain, remember that we're working above gas exchange threshold, so above ventilation threshold, but below critical power. Now what happens is, here we've got the breath by breath data, we've got the square wave response. So the square wave response, we impose the load, and what we would expect to happen is that VO2 will rise over time and then level out where you see that horizontal solid line. But what happens is that that's what we would expect to happen. Okay, we know what the expected response should be. But the VO2 doesn't conform to that in the heavy domain. It starts to level out and then rises again a little bit and then levels out. So the difference between what we would have anticipated to have happened, which is the solid line, and what actually happened, which is the circles, which is the VO2 response, the difference is the Vo2 slow component. And that happens in the heavy exercise domain. But can you see we've still got a deficit? But can you see that the deficit is far greater now than it was in our moderate domain? So again, think about the amplitude. So the amplitude, you can see, gives you a great example. Compare that amplitude there to the amplitude here. Now we go severe. So remember that severe is any exercise above the critical power, but below VO2 max, so because we're dealing with aerobic. So above critical power, this intensity above critical power, what we'd have expected to have happened is that solid horizontal line, but the VO2 response, now we never get steady state. VO2 actually will just keep rising and rising and rising until you reach maximum oxygen uptake, or VO2 max. So we've got these three distinct VO2 responses across defining our three exercise domains: moderate, heavy, and severe. And we've come across these previously, particularly in podcast 5, where we looked at the running economy, and also when we did the understanding of collecting blood lactate responses and the understanding of lactate production and removal. In those podcasts, we recognised that there are clearly different VO2 responses depending upon exercise intensities. I'm not going to dwell on this particularly, but one of the things that Andy Jones and Dave Paul talk about is this idea of a tipping point, that we have an O2 delivery dependent zone and then an O2 delivery independent zone. And in the diseased state, we are really having an issue with O2 delivery. As it becomes decreased, as we start to get a decrease in O2 delivery, for whatever reason, it might be a pathology or whatever, we tip more into this point where it starts to become much more reliant on anaerobic metabolism. And this is some data from our laboratory from a number of years ago, but here what we've done is we've got the VO2 on the y-axis in mils per minute, we've got the time on the x-axis, but this is just to demonstrate to you the difference between moderate and heavy exercise. If you look in the moderate are trials or conditions 1 and 2, heavier conditions 3 and 4. Can you see the difference quite clearly? That in the moderate domain, you can see that we reach steady state quite quickly and it levels out. But look in the heavy domain, trials 3 and 4, can you see that the VO2 rises, looks like it's about to level out, and then kicks again? So the difference between what we would have expected, where it's just starting to level out in, say, trials 3 and 4, 4 is a really good example. You can see where it's almost leveled out. So if you drew a horizontal line across from where it almost leveled out, the difference between that and what actually happens, which is the VO2 response, is the Vo2 slow component. What's quite neat about this is, in trials 2 and 4, the participants had had half a litre of blood removed. And what you can see is, despite having a half a litre of blood removed, the VO2 response was actually unaffected. Now that's kind of beyond the scope of what we want to look at today, but it does offer us an enormous insight which suggests that there is a very, very big reserve available to tap into. So if you've got half a litre of blood missing, you've probably got a 9% reduction in hemoglobin concentration. So the result, it's really telling us that actually we've got a big capacity to cope with these kind of responses.